Let me welcome you. I'm Glenn Moots, a professor here at Northwood and also director of our Forum for Citizenship and Enterprise. This is our 5th program for the semester, and happily we don't have to compete with the World Series or the election. So we're happy about that. Now, the Forum concludes its semester's programming with this debate tonight, which is something of a signature event, because our theme this semester has been, is capitalism moral? Now, when I told people of the theme, I got some curious responses, as you can imagine. Of course it is. The world is agreed. The Cold War is over. Where are the opponents of capitalism? And to be honest, I actually had trouble finding them for this debate. At least someone who was willing to take that position for the debate. In fact, I had similar trouble finding someone to debate against right to work in Michigan. The debate that you may have seen 2 weeks ago, I couldn't find anybody. And I really had to put that debate off for a while, which was disappointing. Now, after all, too, isn't this a foregone conclusion at Northwood? So if you read the sign on the way in, right, Northwood is educating the future leaders of a global free enterprise society. But before you think that it's a dead issue and maybe you should be home watching Netflix, let me give you what I think are 3 salient points. First, to say that you agree with something does not mean that you understand it. To assert one's agreement with capitalism, for example, does not mean that you can defend or even explain that assertion. John Stuart Mill famously said, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that." If he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the other side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. Second, look at our candidates and now our president-elect. How many of their solutions to pressing political and economic problems are rooted in a foundation of private investment, capital formation, and property rights? Need I say more? Third, and this may be the most important reason, it's right under our nose. A study conducted by Harvard polled young adults between the ages of 18 and 29. That's what? 97% of this audience. And found that 51% do not support capitalism. Just 42% said that they support it. And in a way that makes sense, because every generation begins a new debate about political and economic systems and their value, based on their own understanding of those systems and the context in which they understand them. So here tonight, we are an audience of millennials who must make up our minds about what capitalism is and whether it is moral. And as always, for all of our programs, we acknowledge our tremendous debt to our co-sponsors, the Institute for Humane Studies and the John Templeton Foundation. They've been our partners throughout the semester, and they have supported tonight's event as well. And students, if you have interest in the Institute for Humane Studies, which supports programs pertaining to liberty, please let me know or Dr. Matchek know, and we'll be happy to assist you. They have a number of great summer programs as well as opportunities for graduate school. And the IHS is supported by the John Templeton Foundation, which serves as a philanthropic catalyst for discoveries related to the big questions of human purpose and ultimate reality. Now, students, IHS wants your feedback. So when you came in, hopefully you got a little slip with a mini URL on there. And you can use that on your phone, your tablet, or your computer. Just put it right in as the address, and you'll get a short survey. IHS wants to know what you think about this, and I'm always curious to know who did a better job with the debate. And I'll be happy to tell Troy and Doug about that. So with that, I'm going to turn you over to our moderator, Mr. David Nicholas. He has been on staff with CMU Public Broadcasting since 1990. He is no stranger to politics, having hosted and produced both Meet the Candidates and Capitol Report for CMU Public Television since 2002. He's also served as music director, including being the host and producer of Nightside Jazz and Blues, Mosaic, which runs Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. until noon, and you can also hear him on The Beat, Saturdays from 11 to 2. He's also served as news director and morning edition host from 2001 to 2015. Mr. Nicholas will introduce our speakers and the format, and with that, we'll get started. Please join me in welcoming Mr. David Nicholas.
Thank you, Professor Moots. It's good to see everyone back. Depending on who you voted for, depending on who you were rooting for in the World Series, all those things are now at least past, and we move on. We have two wonderful guests that are going to be debating the topic that Professor Moots told you about. Let me first introduce Doug Bandow. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and a columnist for Forbes Online. Served as a special assistant to President Ronald Reagan, also a nationally syndicated columnist with Copley News Service and editor of the monthly political magazine Inquiry, and has been widely published in such periodicals as Time, Newsweek, and Fortune, as well as leading newspapers including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post. He's written several books including The Politics of Plunder, Misgovernment in Washington, and Beyond Good Intentions, A Biblical View of Politics. Received his B.S. in economics from Florida State University in 1976 and his J.D. from Stanford University in 1979. Please welcome Doug Bandow.
It's bombed up, but don't worry.
Bandow, excuse me. There's my first gaffe, hopefully the last. My apologies. Secondly, to my left is Troy Catterson. He is an assistant professor of philosophy at Salve Regina University in Rhode Island. He studied at Boston University, where he received a PhD in philosophy, specializing in mathematical logic. He has published major articles in modal metaphysics, epistemology, meta-ethics, and the philosophy of religion. His master's thesis won second prize in a Templeton Foundation-sponsored contest, answering the question, what can we learn about God through science? He was also invited by Synthes, rated by Google Scholar as the top journal in philosophy, to guest edit a volume on the question of personal identity. His current research interests center around the interplay between theology, science, and ethics. Please welcome Troy Catterson. The debate is the same as 2 weeks ago, and either a coin flip or however they decided. We have opening statements first, and what we'll do is we'll just keep flip-flopping the order. Where we start, the next one starts the next segment, and back and forth we go. We'll have opening statements, a period of cross-examination. We'll have a bit of a break where we'll be soliciting your questions. The Q&A will be into the second half, and hopefully we'll get to 20 or so, maybe more minutes for that, where a question can be directed to either one person or both, and we'll again alternate that, and the first answer would be a 60-second response, and then a 30-second reply, and then there'll be closing statements where, again, we'll flip that back and forth. And please, if I get off of that order, feel free to, I don't know, whatever they allow. Paper wads, flare guns, something like that. We'll try, because we want to keep fair and make sure that everyone has their time. Remind both of our speakers that your 15 minutes are to use as you wish. You can yield some of that time, and that doesn't add on to the other, but as far as I'm concerned, we would add in any shortened time from either opening statements or the cross-examination into the Q&A. So with that, we will begin with, as the order did predetermine, and a 15-minute opening statement from Mr. Doug Bandow.
Well, thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be back to Northwood. It's certainly an interesting time to be discussing these issues. There's a famous old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. And I think that last week's election has thrust us into that. A real question is where we are going as a country. I think a lot of issues are up in the air. that, as Glenn mentioned, there was the poll that suggested a lack of support among young people for capitalism. That same poll showed that people over 30 and over only got slight majority support for capitalism. Only 26% of them declared themselves to be capitalists. So this really is an issue, I think, that we have to take seriously. Any human structure, any human institution, one should be prepared to question. There's no reason to take as a given that any economic, political, or other system, is a perfect system. We're sinful human beings. We make a lot of mistakes. Any structures that we create will also be tainted by a lot of the same problems. I think if we look at capitalism, to me, the real issue in a certain way is the moral question. The practical question, I would argue, was answered. That is, the 20th century in many ways was a struggle between capitalism and collectivism, and what we found by the end of that century was that on any practical ground, capitalism won. That if you want to have stuff, if you want to have production, if you want to have creativity and economic system, that we know the system that will result in that. That it's going to be markets in some form of a liberal economic order, some form of an open economy. And while there are always going to be problems, one can simply look back to 2008 and recognize a mixture there of kind of human failings plus, I think, policy failings can create extraordinary economic problems. In many ways, what's striking from the kind of problems we faced in 2008 is that they're so shocking because we expected better. That we come to kind of expect continuing economic growth and a future unbounded as opposed to a future that suddenly becomes clouded in a time of distress and problem. I think the real question, though, then, is the moral one, which is a very different question, a very important one. And in asking that question, one really has to start out in certain ways, I think, and ask, what is capitalism itself? There are a lot of systems around the world that have elements of capitalism. They have private property, perhaps. They have some forms of markets. They have some aspects that we would point to and think of as a capitalist system. But there are an awful lot of them turn out to be kleptocracies. They're crony capitalists. There are systems of basically organized looting through which the political system exploits any kind of private economic activity. The old Marcos regime that goes back about 30 years, people talked about the Marcoses engaged in mining. That is, they went around the economy and said, that's mine, and that's mine. And some people viewed that as a capitalist system. But I would argue that really had very little to do with capitalism. It was a kleptocratic regime in which the dictator and his wife could basically exploit to their heart's content, that they could put their friends in charge of monopolies, they could basically assure profits to those who they wanted. I would argue that capitalism, what we're focused on, is a competitive open economy. That what characterizes capitalism is economic freedom, a market system, a system in which there's open entry, a system in which there's competition, a system in which entrepreneurship can flourish. There are always going to be differences via different cultures and different institutions. To my mind, the ultimate institution of a market is not Wall Street or some fantastic big buildings. It's an institution that I typically have seen all over the world when I travel, which is the flea market, which is almost anywhere you go, people go out, they put out a blanket, they bring out stuff to sell. I think the notion, to my mind, the philosophical understanding or the underlying notion of capitalism is one of capitalist acts between consenting adults. The notion that we can go out there and make decisions in terms of what we want to sell, how we want to labor, make economic decisions with one another. To me, that's really the fundamental issue at stake. And the question then becomes, is this kind of economic liberty moral? Is this itself a value that we should appreciate? And I would argue that the answer is presumptively yes. And I think there are a couple of aspects of that. One of which is a philosophical one. I don't claim to have great philosophical knowledge or a PhD. But to my mind, the whole notion of allowing the human being to control their own labor, their own economic future, really affirms the basic dignity and human rights of an individual and the basic moral agent within a society. We all exist within various social institutions, but ultimately judgment is rendered upon us as an individual in the moral decisions that we make. Among kind of that moral decision that we should have is control over our own economic destiny. That there's something, I think, very important about placing that with individuals, even when we make big mistakes. And any of us, of course, who have family and friends, almost certainly have family and friends who we stand back at times in horror at the kind of decisions that they make. Nevertheless, one can't really imagine putting these decisions, putting this authority somewhere else. It ultimately really has to be with the people who are responsible for them and for who are most affected by them. So it strikes me that that is an underlying philosophical sense. I think there's also a practical element to the question which really bleeds over into a more moral or philosophical sense, which is looking at how capitalism operates and how the benefits are distributed. And I would argue the practical benefits of a capitalist system are extraordinarily important and have moral overtones. One is simply the productivity of a free economic system. The issue is not, oh, he who has the most toys wins, kind of a bumper sticker you sometimes might see. It strikes me if that's one's philosophy, one misses an awful lot about humanity. But there is an extraordinary value in terms of the enrichment of the human person and family and community that comes from economic productivity, new technologies, and transformations of one's economy. I mean, part of that is simply kind of general production. If one simply, on any measure, free economic systems are more productive. But I think there's incentives matter in terms of the openness of an economy matters in terms of how they operate. One aspect of that is the question of kind of high technology and transformation, many of the things which people in this audience would very much appreciate. If one likes iPhones, if one likes computers, if one likes iPods, for the most part, these are creations of human creativity that come out of a free economic system, not out of a state-run economic system. It's hard to imagine getting those kinds of transformations. When I was in law school, I had a typewriter for typing my papers, and there were no computers at the time. And I was quite excited to get a job at the Hoover Institution because I could use their self-correcting electric typewriter as opposed to my very cheap old one that required, fluid and stuff if I made a mistake. Well, in the Reagan campaign, which I worked in, we had a small manual typewriter on the airplane. That was the highest technology for a presidential campaign at the time. 4 years later, people had computers. That kind of a transformation is one that comes from a free economic system that rewards entrepreneurship, not from a state-run system. And if you look at so many areas, whether it be IT and healthcare, transportation, the ability to fly around the world, to go from US to China in a day, these kinds of things, I would argue, come out of that system with enormous, really, enrichment, for the human person. But beyond that, it's simply the most practical kinds of goods and services. I was struck when I first visited the Soviet Union. My reaction was that they had to be basically recycling their tanks into toilet paper. I mean, this was a society that could not even make the most basic consumer good. And when we left, we had a conference there. We gave to the Russian journalists that we were dealing with pens and pencils and aspirin and anything that we had. Because in that society, they found it very hard to get even the most basic goods. There's something there, I think, that's undignifying. The notion you can't even get these kind of necessities of life that all of us would agree have extraordinary benefits. We're not talking about wonderful toys that we want to play with, but we're talking about things that are very important, I would argue, for the operation of our lives, for our families and communities. And I think what's important here is when you think about all of these levels, it's not just the kinds of stuff you get, it's also who decides the production. The value of a capitalist society is that ultimately it's us who make the decision. Lots of rich people out there. Donald Trump certainly has been in the news. We think of a Bill Gates in terms of having extraordinary economic power. But the reality is that for the most part, our economy is consumer driven. The kinds of automobiles that are built, the kinds of homes that are built, these respond to a mass market. They respond to all of us. The kinds of things that are produced, ultimately, the ability of any single person, any single wealthy person to try to control that is very hard. Indeed, I think what's important is to see the times where large corporations, moneyed corporations, try to push products and fail. If you've ever heard, this for younger generations, probably passed away, but one of the terms that we would use is an Edsel, as being a failure, a disaster. Now, an Edsel was supposed to be the product for Ford Motor Company. It was named after the son of the founder, and it was supposed to be an honor. It's going to be a wonderful new automobile, massive amount of money put behind it, and consumers didn't want to buy it. And the point is the company could put a lot of money into it, it couldn't make anybody buy it, and it became an extraordinary failure. You look at all of the kind of companies that have failed along the way, the computers that were created and have disappeared. When I first bought my computer as an Apple II Plus, friends of mine were buying things like K-Pros that have completely disappeared. It's consumers who make these determinations. And I think that's a very important benefit of a market system. Moreover, this bleeds over into the political and other spheres in that what capitalism is very good at doing is helping to diffuse power. That suddenly there are alternatives. It's not just a political system. It's not a unified power system. What you find is indeed you're splitting apart different forms of power that help check one another. There's a Soviet defector who was quoted in the Washington Post many years ago, a wife of a diplomat, who was asked, what was it like to dress in Soviet clothes? And her response was, I never wore Soviet clothes. We had Western clothes. She was part of the nomenclatura. She was part of the elite. So she used her political power for economic ends. I visited North Korea back about 25 years ago. Very strange experience. But one of the things they had were hard currency stores. So I had real money, that is dollars. I could walk in, change those, and buy myself Coca-Cola. I could buy snacks. I could buy whatever I wanted. And North Koreans who worked overseas, who had access to Western currency, could do the same. North Koreans who simply lived and worked within North Korea had no such option. Those with political influence also had economic power. In the US, it's much more complicated. People, of course, try to get both. You're in politics, you want economic power. If you're in economics, you want to try to buy political power. But it becomes much more complicated. Moreover, a free economy helps distribute some of the tools of freedom. When you start seeing other societies, the whole role of Twitter and the role of iPhones and all sorts of technologies, what you see is very much a subversive element that is introduced, even in a place like China, which faces extraordinary challenges. I've gone there 6 years in a row to teach in the summer. All the Chinese students have iPods, they have iPhones, they love the internet, they hate censorship. They're also very nationalistic, nevertheless, in a lot of very powerful ways. They're aware of the world, they know there's information out there they are denied, they like this access, and I think it's helpful and subversive of political power. So I think all of these are very important aspects and very positive benefits of a market system. Nevertheless, there's still weaknesses and there's still problems within a market system. Indeed, I think it's important to recognize the limits of any kind of a market system, any kind of a capitalist system, but it's also important to recognize where those problems lead to and what the answers are. The most obvious, I suppose, is the issue of poverty. We live in a world in which we have come to have great expectations for the future. My guess is most everybody in this room expects to have a better future. You expect to live better than your parents. You hope to have that kind of future to pass on to your children. Nevertheless, there are a lot of people in American society who don't share in those benefits. I think what's important to realize, the problem here is not that capitalism causes that, but capitalism does not claim to solve that problem. That is, until 200 or 300 years ago, the expectation of humanity was that basically everybody would be poor. The only people who were wealthy would be, if you're Attila and you could send the hordes out to steal from everybody else. If you were in the ruling elite, if you were the king or the aristocracy and everybody toiled for you, you'd live reasonably well and nobody else did. It was the rise of a mercantile or a kind of a commercial society that transformed that. Indeed, Marx pointed out the extraordinary productivity of the capitalist system. And then the capitalist system was highly subversive of aristocracy, of all these aristocrats who live in this wonderful hierarchy, and all these commoners out there are making money. And you find in Britain this wonderful system by which if you're an aristocrat and you don't have any cash, you have to sell off your land. You can sell your title. Get a little cash in from these new folks who have money. That it was the rise of the commercial society that's really convinced people that prosperity was possible. And now we ask, why are people poor? We don't ask, why are people rich? The problem is that markets claim to do one thing and one thing well, which is reward people for economic productivity, does not claim to reward people for virtue. So the challenge for us is we have to go outside of a market system to help people who have problems of poverty. Other issues out there, concentrated economic power, monopolies almost always are political. The strongest monopolies tend to be political, not economic systems. We all make bad decisions, but it's far worse to turn those bad decisions into political decisions. And we have a problem of non-economic values. I think a very important issue at stake of what happens with markets on non-economic values. They aren't necessarily helpful. On the other hand, to whom do you turn those over? But again, we have to look outside of a market system. A market should be seen as part of a free society. It is not a free society. That a free society has many institutions of which the market is very important, but it's only one, and for many issues like poverty, we must look outside of a market. Thank you.
And before we go to the cross-examination, obviously, time for the other opening statement. And Mr. Catterson, you have your 15 minutes.
Thank you, Doug. That was tremendous. In fact, I find myself in the unenviable position of agreeing with almost everything he said. But that doesn't mean what he said leads to his point. And so hopefully during the cross-examination, we'll examine the arguments and see if they really do lead to the morality of capitalism. But I do want to make one response really quickly, and that is, imagine I have a drug that can kill every cancer cell in the body. Pretend that cancer is like poverty in a society, or lack of wealth. That drug, that alone, that information alone, would not tell me that's a good drug. Because here's the drug, cyanide. It kills cancer because it kills everything. So what I will argue today to you is that capitalism is kind of like a drug, that when you start taking it, it's really good for you. Kind of like steroids. But the long-term effects will inevitably destroy the moral fabric of a society. And since we're asking the question of morality, we must then say, since capitalism destroys the moral fabric of our society, it's not morally good. Despite all of the other benefits it gives us, it cannot give the one good that can only be counted as moral, and that's moral individuals and a society that affirms moral absolutes. So I'm going to talk about this in two respects. First, I'm going to argue that capitalist societies destroy the moral consensus of a society, thus weakening the commonwealth. And what I mean by the commonwealth is just the kind of common good that binds us together as a community and as a nation, as a people. A nation divided against itself cannot stand. But every nation pursues a good. And if those goods are different and conflicting, the nation will eventually decay and fall. So how does capitalist societies do this? Well, capitalist societies are commercial societies. In other words, they encourage free trade. This has been recognized all the way back from Aristotle. Montesquieu was famous for bringing this up in his Spirit of the Laws. In his book 20 on commercial societies, he says the one thing that we see with commercial societies is that they always soften morality for that society. And then he brings up Holland as the supreme example, where everything is bought and sold, including virtue. And so I want to argue that he's right. What happens with trading societies? Well, a capitalist society, and I'm going to agree with Doug here, is a free market society. And a free market society, in order to be effective, must have free trade. It must globalize. It must allow its markets to be open not only to internal companies and competition, it must allow for world competition. And therefore, you're going to have a lot of intercourse with other cultures. Now, these cultures are going to have, therefore, an effect on the society that's trading with them. These are just facts. So the trading will occur, and as the nation prospers, which will occur in a capitalist society, in a free trading society, you'll have a great amount of prosperity. And so two forms of multiculturalism will occur in this society. First, you will have immigration into the society. That society is so prosperous that people from other cultures will come in, and they will settle and then form different subcultures within the society. And also you will have different businesses, world businesses coming and settling and doing business in the society. And then finally, in the educational part of the society, in the society like college, you're going to have the intelligentsia considering the claims of other cultural systems. Because now you have knowledge of difference. Now this is important for morality because most people think that morality is something that you can rationally figure out. But that's not the way most people hold their moral beliefs, let's face it. For example, if I asked you, is the golden rule a good rule? The golden rule being treat your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Most of us would say yes, and that's obvious. So then if I asked you, well, why? What rational reason can you give me that the golden rule is true? Most of us, the average person, is going to say, well, I was just taught that in church. Or I was taught that by my parents. So the average person holds their moral beliefs, and this is good, through what is called sentiment, through tradition and moral authority that comes from the religion that cultivated or that formed the moral consensus in their society. So thus, the average citizen does not have their moral beliefs through some rational process of proof. So what do we have? We have these different now religious traditions come into the society, and what you're going to have is now competition. You're going to have different systems, and they're going to say radically different things. And now the average person is going to wonder, well, which one is right? And there's not going to be any straightforward way of solving that problem. So thus you can have one of four results in a society that becomes more and more cosmopolitan, more and more globalized. You can have relativism crop up. Relativism is just the idea that, well, since there are these different systems, what's true for one culture is not going to be true for this other culture. And so my moral beliefs are going to be different than yours. That's true for me. That's not true for you. And of course, that hurts the idea, therefore, that the moral absolutes that I follow are going to be something that has moral binding force on me because I am in charge of them. I'm the one who decides what to believe morally, and therefore they lose that transcendent, that overriding authority that made them seem like absolute truth and don't have the force to push me to be moral anymore. I can always change them. Then there's moral skepticism. Moral skepticism is when I see, look at all these different beliefs in my society. One group says that abortion is wrong. Another group says it's right. One says it's murder. The other demonizes the other. So what do? Well, we throw up our hands and we go, well, we really can't know what's morally right. Maybe there are no moral absolutes at all. Because there are just so many different beliefs. Does this sound familiar? So then we have a third option, and that's I keep my absolute moral beliefs. I'm a firm Christian. I believe God revealed it. And so therefore, if the Bible says it, it must be true. And all these other people who have different beliefs, I start to demonize them and judge them. And they do the same thing to me. And thus we get what is called moral factionalism. And thus, because our society has these factions, there's no consensus anymore. And then finally, we need a consensus. So what do? We go to what we have in common, don't we? Well, what do we have in common? In a capitalist economy, we have the pursuit of happiness and pleasure. We have the pursuit of personal peace and prosperity. The American dream, the house with the picket fence. We have material goals that everyone came to pursue and can pursue easily. In other words, the economy leaves us with the only thing in common. And so just as Doug is right, that a society that's run by its economy is not good, this seems to then be the only option left in order to develop a consensus. We must all agree that we're pursuing happiness in our own way, and that the happiness of the body and material possessions are things that no one can deny. And so, usually the society opts for a mixture of all four. And you see this from Athens all the way to China, all the way, because China even now is trying to resurrect in the wake of what it sees as a capitalistic corruption of its system, resurrect Confucian values and morality to combat what it sees as the rampant materialism that's corrupting its system. It calls the influence of other societies 和平演变, peaceful evolution or revolution. And in fact, United States diplomats have already cried out that this is the best way to free China up, as Doug has said, is to have the incursion of capitalist markets. But that's the downside of it. It destroys moral consensus. By destroying moral consensus, what it does is destroy every moral system, not just yours, not just the other guys. It weakens the hold of morality on a society altogether, and therefore leads to pure pragmatism. And a capitalist economy that's run by a pragmatic incentive is going to be a corrupt economy, is going to be one where income inequality flourishes. So that's my first argument. The second has to do with the way in which a free market must run itself. Free markets are free because they have to persuade the consumer to buy, just as Doug said. And because of that, they must use persuasion. So I say market economies are marketing economies. So what does that mean? Well, that means that any business, if they're going to be successful, has to have a marketing strategy, and that marketing strategy has to permeate the informational conduits of that society. We might call the media. And so therefore, for the economy to grow, you must persuade for demand. You must increase demand. Now, how are you going to do this? Well, you're going to do this by permeating all the informational conduits, the internet, TV, radio. There must be constant advertising because that's the only way you increase demand. But you're not persuading logicians, my friends. No, you're persuading average people. And what does that mean? That means that you only have 1 minute to get someone to remember your product. So you're going to use arguments from emotion. You're going to attach values to your product that make your client, make the potential customer feel good about your product. It's not about whether your product is really needed. It's about producing the desire for the product. And so therefore, you must grow demand. The best way and most effective way of doing this is not cultivating rational thinking, but cultivating emotion, cultivating the creation and stimulation of wants and desires. And so therefore, want and desire must become the pattern of thinking for a consumer in our society. The new iPhone 5, I don't know, is it 5 now? What is it nowadays? 7. You see, I'm so behind the times. But if the new iPhone 7, how are they going to get us to buy 8? What new difference is going to be more rational that you need it? No, that's not the way we're going to sell it. We're going to sell it like we sell DirecTV. Don't be a guy who attends your own funeral as a guy named Phil Shifley. Get DirecTV, not cable. That's called a slippery slope. If I went through the whole commercial, it would take the rest of my time. But the point is thus we are permeated with messages, but not just messages. We are permeated with a type of thinking called letting your reason be the servant to your emotions and desires, to the consuming impulse. And the better the economy is at persuading, the more pervasive this type of marketing strategy will be. You know this. You watch the Super Bowl for the commercials, don't you? And so, therefore, you destroy virtue in that society, because on any definition of virtue, rationality controls the emotions and desires. Moderation is reason ruling desire. Courage is reason ruling fear. But yet, ID theft occurs, doesn't it? So you need to get the alarm system. You need all of these things, don't you? And then you think you do. And so, we have a dilemma here. It's not that capitalism isn't better than all of its statist alternatives. I totally agree with Doug. It's a better system than any of its statist alternatives. The problem is this. That's like arguing that Hitler is less of a murderer than Stalin or Mao. Yes, true enough, but not good enough. Not good enough to say capitalism is good. What we have is a bunch of economic alternatives trying to solve non-economic problems of the human race. The whole problem is we're thinking in economic terms even when we're asking this question, is capitalism moral? We are reducing value to a single spectrum, the spectrum of how much the state should control the economy. And so what we've done is bought into the lie, it's the economy, stupid. And that enough is confirmation that capitalist economies almost always morph into capitalist societies. And capitalist societies are exactly what we have now. Relativist societies without moral consensus, and societies that are ruled by their passions in their stomach rather than by their reason, and therefore non-virtuous societies. Thank you.
We now move into the cross-examination, the internal or on-stage Q&A, if you will, and we return then to the prior order. And first we will allow Doug to ask Troy in a series of questions. You have 8 minutes for your cross-examination, sir.
So is any moral consensus count as morality? So any society with any moral consensus, that is a moral society by definition?
My argument doesn't depend on that. It only depends on that the lack of any moral consensus destroys even the correct morality.
But if in fact the incorrect morality is present, the destruction of that morality would not be a moral problem, I presume.
I'm sorry, clarify the question.
That is, if the moral consensus within the society is one that most of us would argue is not actually a genuine morality, the destruction of that would not pose a problem.
Not necessarily. But, again, capitalism is like this universal acid. It runs through everything. So, such an acid might be good for one thing, but that, again, is like saying, well, a poison is good for some things, but it's still a poison.
So can a moral society exist only in isolation from other societies, other peoples?
Well, your question, I see where you're going with this, because what you were going to say is, well, you're going to be very impractical here, because then what are we going to do, right? What's the solution? If capitalism is bad, if everything is bad, then what's the solution? Well, my answer to that question would be, I read too much Oswald Spengler when I was a kid, and I think the West is in decline. And I think we're at a stage where culture can no longer control what it created.
But actually my question goes, I think it certainly is a little further, which is, can a moral society exist that is not in isolation from other societies? And does contact with other societies inevitably create the diversity, the other contacts, the competition of ideas, etc., that will destroy the moral consensus?
Well, I would say that in the majority of societies that's the case, but again, it depends on the moral system of the society and how well the people themselves have been acculturated to it. But my point is only that capitalism encourages the weakening of those moral systems because you need cooperation among people. And so you cannot demonize your trading partner. You cannot see them as evil. So now say, for example, you have a group of people, as Herodotus talked about, when he went traveling, and this happened in ancient Athens. Athens, of course, was a commercial society, probably the most capitalistic society, to speak anachronistically, of its era. And one of the big problems had is, okay, here's Herodotus, the famous historian, travels around Egypt, travels all over Persia, and he finds these societies doing things that the Greeks find completely abhorrent. They actually bury their dead. Things like that. And so now, where does morality come from? It comes from this idea of horror and of awe of the sacred. It's not the same thing to say it's irrational to kill somebody as to say it's immoral and evil. One produces feelings of horror, the other just says you're stupid. And I'm sorry, stupid people, I may not like them all that much, but I don't think they're evil per se. So thus, you have this idea that morality is built on tradition that creates awe and revelation. And that's the real problem with multiculturalism. It creates a competition where there's no way of adjudicating between the competing claims, because one says God, one says Allah said it, the other one says Yahweh said it, and the other says Vishnu said it, and so on.
Now, But then, so all of these different beliefs are essentially equivalent from the standpoint of having a moral society. That what matters is a moral consensus, not the substance of that consensus.
I'm not saying that. My argument's a negative argument. My argument is, again, that whatever is the true morality, say we have a society that has it. I personally believe in the Christian consensus, but again, when I have a multicultural society, and that multicultural society is such that commercialization causes a real weakening of that moral consensus of the Christian society, maybe the Muslim disagrees with me, but both of our consensuses are weakened, both of our moral systems. Relativism is the enemy of all moral systems, and so is skepticism.
Could you imagine curbs in terms of acculturation and assimilation that would limit the harm of a capitalist system? That would limit the poison or limit the deterioration?
Yes, but again, I think it's kind of like a debate between, in Christian theology, between what are called the antinomians and the nomians, okay? In other words, those who believe that you need to obey moral laws to get to God, and those who believe, no, it's all by faith and not by works. And the debate really is how many laws do you have to obey in order to get to God? One says nothing because it's all by faith, and the other says, no, you got a lot more, and if you don't do that, you're not really having faith. And the real problem is they could find verses in the Bible to support both their positions, right? Jesus says, if you love me, you will obey my commandments in John chapter 15. But then you go to Paul in Romans chapter 6, right? And you have salvation is found through faith alone, and not by works, right? And in Ephesians chapter 2, and so on. And the problem is that both have asked the wrong question. Both still look at faith as a transaction, and therefore asking how big is the transaction? How much do I pay? I think this is the problem with talking in these terms. Really the question is the heart, not programs. When I say we need to stop having statist economies, I'm saying we need a certain type of institution that's distinct from them. When I say we should have more statist economies, I'm saying we need a different type of institution. To me, all of these are sort of institutional attempts to solve a non-institutional problem, a problem that institutions can never solve because they're made up of people who are corrupt. And what you have with different systems is just different ways that exacerbate that corruption, as long as that corruption is there.
In viewing the recently concluded political campaign, I have to wonder, do you see the problem of rationality versus emotional advertising as one that is uniquely caused by capitalism, or is that something that's much more inherent to the human person and a vulnerability that transcends any kind of economic system?
1 minute left.
I would say that capitalism encourages it because it's an economy of persuasion, and therefore it leads to political institutions that are suitable to it, like you yourself have argued in many places. And persuasion has to be to the masses. And because in a wide democracy, you cannot talk about, for example, how my health policy, here's the 500-page referendum on why my health policy is better than my opponent's health policy. No, I have to use arguments that last a minute. And those arguments are almost always fallacious and have to appeal to creating a good feeling about the person and their plan. And therefore, that destroys virtue.
We were slightly inside the 30 seconds, so we will conclude that half of the cross-examination there. Very good internal timing, if you will. We will reverse the cross-examination now, and Troy, give you the opportunity also for your 8 minutes then to question Doug.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Thank you. Okay, I want to concentrate on what I see to be 3 major arguments that you give for capitalism being good. The first I want to call the freedom argument. Okay. And the way it seems to go, and then there's another twist on it, which is the diffusing of power argument. But I want to first talk about the freedom argument, and I've seen you develop it in other places to great effect. Capitalist economies create more autonomy. This is a universally acknowledged fact. And so, of course, in another place you've said that obviously freedom is the precondition for virtue, and you said a pretty similar thing tonight. So I want to concentrate on that, whether that's effective. I agree that freedom is a precondition for virtue, but I feel what's going on there, and maybe you can respond to this, is a kind of equivocation on the word freedom. Okay? You equivocate when you do something like this. For example, knowledge is power, power corrupts, therefore knowledge corrupts. Okay? Okay? You see how I'm using the word power in two different senses there. One to get you to believe the first statement, the other to get you to believe the second statement, and then I then slip one in on you, and now you have to believe this weird thing that knowledge corrupts. So it seems to me that's what's going on there with your argument, because obviously Aristotle agrees, every moral philosopher has agreed that I need freedom for virtue. But what kind of freedom? Well, it's the kind of freedom that's called the freedom of rationality to rule over the emotions. And Augustine puts it like this, that in Freedom of the Will, in his book on freedom of the will, he says that we are free because rationality can tame the emotions and the desires and therefore rule, but sometimes it doesn't. And since it can give up power, its freedom is in asserting power. So this is what you might call positive freedom. And then you have a negative sort of freedom, which is the power of choice. And this is what capitalism gives us. Capitalism doesn't give us the positive freedom that Augustine talks about. In fact, it erodes it. Because what it does is, in fact, allow you to satisfy more whims, more particular desires that you have. Before you couldn't, before you had to control yourself. Now you can get whatever you want. So I'm wondering, am I misreading your argument there? Can you clarify a little more?
Well, it strikes me the first form of freedom remains extraordinarily important. But the exercise of that freedom, you exercise that most fully when you have options, when you have choices, when your choices are not predetermined by a political decision or by the law. So to my mind, the true exercise of virtue is being able to exercise that first freedom given the options that are out there.
Okay. So then that leads to my second question. So is freedom always good?
I would say that freedom should be the ultimate political end, but the exercise of that freedom is not always a good outcome. That indeed, sinful human beings do bad things, and they will use their freedom at times in very bad ways. That is inevitable with any human. That's the problem of sinful human beings. But that problem is aggravated by the greater, say, the political power that one has over other human beings. That the greatest danger is to provide sinful human beings with extraordinary power which they can exercise over others, which is one reason why markets are good to the extent they diffuse that power. They limit that they limit the potential exercise of ill of that freedom, which is an inevitable risk of any system.
So you see the concentration of power as always more dangerous than the diffusion of power?
There certainly could be some situations where diffusion might be more dangerous, but I'd say as a general principle. To my mind, one kind of marries together the Christian notion of original sin and Lord Acton's axiom that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That the greatest danger is to provide sinful human beings with extraordinary power. That does not mean there may not be virtuous people who could exercise that power. And it doesn't mean that there are moments where the diffusion of power might not have harmful consequences. But as a general principle, I would argue that that diffusion is more likely to lead to better outcomes.
Okay, so then I see you actually as saying something like this, correct me if I'm wrong, that, for example, there might be a people who, for the most part, are not ready for freedom. They're immature. Maybe we might talk about a group of people who have been under a dictatorship for too long, and so therefore do not have the habits and virtues of freedom. And therefore to give them the kind of free economy or free market that another people might deserve and need because they can handle it would be wrong in that situation. Would you agree with that?
Well, I'd say that the creation of social institutions in that society should take into account their situation, their level of knowledge, their level of moral development. That I would hesitate to deny them the importance of freedom. On the other hand, without certain social institutions, civic virtues, and a number of other things, to expect them to develop into what we might view as the correct political system would be a very dangerous thing. I'd hesitate to say the better society for them is one in which they are denied freedom, but I certainly think that we should be very careful trying to prescribe particular social institutions and forms of kind of liberty and whatnot within their own society, kind of disconnected from their own experience and their own situation.
So then, in a sense, what you're saying is we really can't even, that capitalism being good is like a statement saying that, Troy Catterson is short. Yeah, among Americans I am, but among the pygmies I'm not. So it seems that you're saying that capitalism among certain groups of people is good for them, but among other groups, not having the kinds of social, cultural habits and mores that are conducive for them, it might be bad, like sugar is bad for a diabetic, but not bad for the average 21-year-old.
I think I'd say that I would make the argument that economic liberty, broadly defined, would fit almost any society. The particular forms that it takes, the particular institutions through which it operates, the kind of legal rules and constraints within that system should be adapted to the level of that society in terms of its developments. And I think of, say, the post-communist world, I think many of us probably had far too great expectations of taking a society from totalitarian communism into democratic capitalism and imagined that we could kind of rush it through where you didn't have these kind of moral developments underneath as a foundation. And that, I think, you have to take that into account.
Okay, so then certainly the French Revolution was too big of a leap too soon.
And I'm not sure that it represented liberty properly when you're chopping off people's heads. Robespierre is not. Robespierre does not strike me as a great libertarian who I would identify with.
30 seconds. All right, thank you to both. And we will now take about a 10-minute break. Speakers can work on their closing statements, and all of you will have the opportunity to the little URL cards. There is a reference that refers here to a Professor Richard Wolff, who was originally going to be on the panel before a change was made. And so even though you see that, don't think that makes it invalid. If you go to that URL, it will be taking you to the survey that deals with these two gentlemen. So, if you would like to be Professor Richard Wolff, that is your option. With that, then we'll move into the question and answer portion. We'll begin first with Doug, and as questions are addressed, starting here, going here, back and forth, we'll try to alternate those once again. Each question, once it's asked, first response gets 60 seconds, and then a 30-second reply is allowed. We'll get through as many of these as possible. Many, many good questions, so good to all of you. We may not get to all, but as I did 2 weeks ago, I've collected all of them, and when all this is said and done, I'll be getting back with Professor Moots so that he has a feel for all of that feedback as we kind of close out the two debate events. So, and some may be worded in a similar way, so if I paraphrase or use the wording from one and it's not yours, but your question is about the same, it's just kind of in the order that we go. But I salute all of you for some very good questions. So with that, we will begin, and because of the alternation, we will begin first with a question to you, Mr. Bandow. How does capitalism address those who are not ready for or responsible with total freedom?
Well, I think we already deal with that problem with children. We deal with with difficulty. We deal with that of people who we believe have various problems, developmental problems, or others in terms of guardianship of different forms. It's going to be inherently arbitrary. I mean, the question, why 18? Why not 16? Why not 20? We make arbitrary judgments, but we deal with it, I think, to the extent that we can, recognizing that not everyone is a level of development that can have full freedoms, can have full legal rights, can have full economic rights. I don't see a way around that. That's always going to be a challenge for us, because human beings do develop in ways that clearly they gain capabilities over time. And it's a relatively arbitrary choice where you put that. It's very hard to make an individualized judgment for every human being.
Your 30-second response?
Yes, and I would just extend that to groups of people, because cultures create what is called a Weltanschauung, a worldview, and therefore a mentality that's either mature enough for freedom or not. And And so I think with that in mind, it then becomes such that you can then ask whether a society itself is ready for capitalism.
Next question then, and this is directed first to you, Troy, and the wording is, would a free capitalist society create the debate necessary for people to come closer to a, quote, true morality?
That's an excellent question. I think we often confuse capitalist or economic freedom with political freedom, and they're not necessarily equivalent. It might be that a society is politically free and therefore votes to not have a capitalist society, not have a capitalist economy. Those two are not contradictions in terms. And so, thus, we can't necessarily say because we have a capitalist society that we're going to have, for example, China is an example of this. Its Chinese-style socialism is more capitalist than a lot of capitalist countries, and yet it does not have the political freedom.
30 seconds.
Well, I think the challenge here is, do we want moral debate? If one believes that the essence of morality is a moral consensus, no society presumably wants a debate. On the other hand, if one believes there's an absolute standard of morality, one would like to see that debate in societies where the moral consensus is of a different sort. And I think that's part of the challenge of getting through this issue.
Next question, and we come first to you, Doug, for this. How do you explain the morality of capitalism to individuals who were negatively affected by what is seen as a fraudulent and immoral behavior of a bank or a pivotal market in our economy?
Well, the most important thing, of course, is not to bail out fraudulent bankers. I mean, the worst sort of corporate welfare is about the worst thing one can do. My belief is that freedom requires accountability, that one should be accountable for one's actions. And the worst thing you can have in a so-called capitalist society is have a system where I get the gains and I give you the losses. And unfortunately, that's an awful lot of what happened in 2008. To my mind, that runs directly contrary to what a market system or a capitalist society should be.
Your 30-second response.
I agree.
All right. This question then for you, Troy. How will you decide if someone is moral enough to hold power? Won't there always be immoral people in a community no matter what the economic system?
Well, first, I haven't argued that you need more state control. I have argued that capitalism is evil. And I haven't actually even hinted at a solution to it. But the topic of debate was, is it evil? And if I have proven that point, then I've done my job. The question of solutions is another excellent debate. But sometimes we just need to focus our energy on one point at a time, I guess.
Your response?
Well, it strikes me that capitalism may have ill effects. I don't think that means it's evil. And the question is, can those effects be contained? That indeed almost any human system is going to have problems, but one's going to have, does it result in irresolvable problems or problems that one cannot contain? And I think that's a major issue.
To come back to this question then, in a capitalist economy, Doug, what will happen to people with mental or physical disabilities who can't perform at a high or competitive level? I believe terms that you use to describe the free market economy.
Well, I think my view is a free society has much more than a capitalist economic system. A capitalist economic system is a bedrock part of a free society. The advantages of a capitalist economic system is it provides us with resources that can be directed at those who are in need. I mean, a capitalist system does not claim to be able to respond to those who don't have economic skills. That's something that I think is a larger moral duty on the rest of us. Capitalism provides us with those resources, but we have to look outside the economic institution. We have to look at, whether it be the independent sector, churches, and other things. To me, it's a free society, not a capitalist system, that provides that answer.
And your response?
I think the main question of disagreement between Doug and I is whether a capitalist economy can be contained and therefore remain just the economy and not become a society. And obviously I've argued that in order for a capitalist economy to be effective and develop into the kinds of benefits that Doug argues for, it must change the society and corrupt it.
Next question then, and we begin with you, Troy. This person writes, as a student, I feel that millennials believe big government is the solution and not capitalism. Why do you think the younger generation believes in big government?
I think we always look for something we haven't tried when what we have tried has failed. And since big government is something that a lot of us have not experienced to the level of other nations, we see it as something that, why don't we try that?
Your response to the
Well, I mean, it strikes me that when people use the word socialism today, they don't really mean socialism. Bernie Sanders is not a socialist. Bernie Sanders is a redistributionist. Sweden is not a socialist country. It's a redistributionist society. It has a free market economic system. So I think part of the issue here is it's a word that people identify something positive to that actually don't have what it really is and what it traditionally meant.
Next question then is for you. Earlier you stated that capitalism can diffuse power. Could you give an example in a non-communist country?
Well, I mean, one of the great things, Hillary Clinton is going to go out in the world and be some kind of a political and economic figure despite losing the presidential election. You know, in a society where you merge political and economic power, you lose political power, you lose everything. It's all gone. I mean, the advantage of private, of systems that have a whole private economy is it's completely separate from politics, which means there are separate power centers. Businesses get in the way of politicians. Different businesses have different power, and whether it be a car dealership versus a major corporation versus major other things. A lot of different sources of power, a lot of different checks and balances within that system.
Your response?
Yeah, I think the crucial element to Doug's response is the complete separation of the economic and governmental system in the system he envisions as the best system. And I think that doesn't always happen. I think that what happens often is that power is redistributed, but usually to those with the most money. And because in a free system, money buys advertisement and money buys, therefore, political clout, you just have a redistribution of power and it's reconcentrated.
The next question is to you, Troy. Do you think that certain societies would be better off now if the West would not get in touch with them? And that is how it is written.
Yeah, I don't know. Again, I do agree with Doug with one thing. An asset is good for many things. Sometimes you need an asset to clean up dirt, to destroy a system that's inherently corrupt. But my argument has always been that a universal asset can only harm everything that it comes in contact with. And so it might be that certain systems will benefit from capitalism, but it will always be the case that some systems, and that in the end, every system will be burned by capitalism.
And your response?
Well, I think part of the problem here is it's very hard for us to judge other systems and make decisions for them. And trying to decide whether or not other societies should have or not have capitalism is a fairly arrogant kind of assertion of our power. Tends not to work well. Social engineering is a problem at home. Trying to achieve it overseas, as we've seen in recent years, does not work very well at all. And I think it's very hard to make that judgment for others, though I think it may be in doubt. Yeah.
The question comes back to you, and this was not directed at either, but we will let you take the first crack at this. If no society is truly moral, would capitalism be considered more morally correct than the others? Won't most people be attracted to a more moral society than one that is not?
Well, I would argue that a society which at the very least diffuses power and limits the potential of human harm of sinful human beings is likely to be a better and more moral society than one that does not. And recognizing the problem of people of ill will always use any system to try to gain their own advantage. The problem is, in my view, is the political as opposed to the economic. The political system allows that. You have that problem.
Your response? If no society is truly moral, would capitalism be considered more morally correct than the others? Won't most people be attracted to a more moral society than one that is not?
I don't necessarily agree that capitalism is more moral than the others. I think that capitalism just creates a different type of evil than the others. And so, thus, it's like choosing between arsenic and cyanide. Do I want to die slowly or quickly? And so I think that economic solutions to human problems are the real problem. And when we're looking and saying, okay, which economic system we're going to pick, we've already bought into the lie that humanity is all about economics.
And that leads then to a final question for you, Troy. What economic system then is the most moral, and why?
I think I've answered the question. I think all of them have different evils that they, a statist economy will destroy freedom and therefore destroy many virtues because they destroy freedom in the choice sense. But as I argued, a capitalist economy destroys virtue and the ability for a society to even have a rational adjudication on what constitutes right and wrong, because it undermines the whole question of moral absolutes. And so, again, it's not which economy is better, it's which group of people is better, and in other words, can we become virtuous enough to make economics not something that destroys us?
So as I would argue, that the question is which system is more susceptible to abuse by sinful human beings who can be bad in either system. And I would argue that while capitalism may be an asset in its own way, statist systems are a far worse asset. That our historic experience, at least, is those who gain power, the way you extend your power tends to be to destroy morality. That moral concepts get in the way of the exercise of political power and the advantages that those who hold political power seek. And they are much more likely to use concentrated power, both economic and political, to destroy morality as opposed to build it up.
And with that, in response to a final question, we will move to the closing statements. And as we have tried, and no one's thrown anything at me, so I think we have done successfully, kept our rotation here going back and forth. This time for the 8-minute closing statement. First, the podium is yours, Troy.
There's an old Chinese story that the philosopher Mencius brings up that I think really sort of summarizes what I think Doug's argument is and kind of exposes it a little. And that's, there was a king that Mencius was hired by to be his consultant. And he said, why is everybody leaving my country? Why is everybody going to these other countries? I'm a lot better king than they are. I don't oppress them. I don't go to these wars. I do not steal their crops. My taxes are lower. Why is it, therefore, that my country doesn't become as prosperous as these other countries? And Mencius says this. He says, well, there was this army that fought this other army, and it lost. Half the army retreated 100 paces. The other half retreated 50 paces. And the half that retreated 50 paces turned around and started making fun of those who ran back 100 paces and called them cowards. And he says, Your Majesty, that's 50 feet laughing at 100 feet. And he says, that's what you're doing. You yourself are bad, but you're not as bad as everybody else. You're 50 feet laughing at 100 feet. But aren't they all cowards? Aren't they all bad? And that's the question we need to ask ourselves tonight. Which of us has proven that capitalism, the morality of capitalism? Now, the problem is capitalism itself has become a moving target. We call it free markets, but Doug has sort of changed the definition of free market every time I've asked him, because he's brought in the idea of different institutions and different regulations of government that government might bring in to fix the abuses that might occur that I have brought up. And so my first question is always, well, then what makes an economy free? What kind of regulation is still non-freedom infringing in the economy? If we can't fix what it is that makes a market free, even though there's government regulation, as he has admitted, then maybe we're talking past each other. But there's an even more important problem, and that is, let us suppose let us just say that we're just going to have minimal regulation on the economy. what we still have is both of my arguments use a essential feature of the market economy to show that it leads to the destruction of morality. In other words, it makes for immoral societies. If capitalism, by its very mechanisms, makes for an immoral society by creating a society of consumers and desirers and hedonists, a society where courage cannot flourish, where moderation cannot flourish, where justice, which requires courage and moderation, cannot even get off the ground, then obviously capitalism itself leads to the destruction of the Commonwealth. So what Doug has to show us is that not only does capitalism have good effects, he has to show us that it can avoid the bad effects, and that the bad effects are not a product of the very mechanisms of the market economy that I have argued. He has to attack some of my premises. He has to show where my arguments don't follow. That has not happened, and so that's the first problem. Now, of course, in these debates, we always want to say, well, then, what's our alternative? What do we do? And my point is, what we do is we work at changing culture. Because when culture changes, institutions change, not the other way around. Institutions don't do anything but corrupt, precisely because they're not human. And they actually enslave humans, just in different ways. My opponent says that market economies diffuse power. They don't diffuse power. They just change where power is being held. In the old monarchic and class societies, you had nobles that held power and kings, and they were held on the basis of honor and heredity. But now we have a new power class. It's the rich. And the rich hold power precisely because they have money. And they can influence the political system with their money. And it's unrealistic to think that those with a lot of money will not influence the political system. Look at the two-party system that we have now, and why a third party can't ever, as things go, get enough money to get enough coverage, to get enough advertising, to get enough votes. And so there's just a new class system, except now the class system isn't based on honor, it's based on self-interest. Yes, self-interest is not greed, I agree, but that does not mean that self-interest should be the basis and root of a society. So our basic disagreement stands. A market economy must become a market society. It must permeate the society. It must change the view of what humanity is in that society, always to the lowest common denominator. If that is not the case, then we need to know how that can be stopped, and when that is stopped, why that's still a free market. Thank you.
Well, it's been a fun time and a lot of interesting issues on the table. My definition of capitalism is very simple. It's economic liberty. It manifests itself through different institutions. There may be different regulatory regimes, but the ultimate question is whether we are free as human beings to sell and buy our labor and our products. And I think that clearly that kind of a system has extraordinary benefits, including the diffusion of power. It's not that people don't try to combine the two, but it's a system that naturally separates them, in contrast to political systems where the political system normally exercises control over economics and concentrates. If you are Kim Jong-un in North Korea, you have all the economic goods you want. President Obama did not have command over every resource that he wanted. And while rich people have influence, it's notable that the man who won the presidential election spent half as much as the person he defeated. That it turns out money did not determine that, something else determined the outcome of that election. I think the challenge for us is that capitalism clearly offers the best practical benefits. The question then is, what is the moral impact? And I think that it's an illusion to assume that there may not be a universal human solvent out there that is purely capitalist. When one thinks about the way statist economies and statist systems and heavily politicized systems have operated and their impact on morality, it's hard to see them as being positive in any form. I would argue that the harm that is created by those systems on a moral code is far greater than that one sees through any kind of a capitalist system. But the question for us is, if there's no obvious alternative, then what are the practical steps that one might take to try to preserve moral values that one might worry about in a capitalist system? And I think, going back, one of the challenges here is, does one believe that genuine, profound, deeply rooted moral values are so vulnerable that they can be washed away by the solvent of capitalism? Or does one view that solvent as being most likely to work against the fake moral values that very often are promoted by heavily political systems? I think of Nazism and communism and fascism and a number of the isms out there that promote moral codes that most of us view as odious and which did not have long-lasting effect, versus that of, say, Christianity that's rooted in history and tradition of thousands of years. That indeed, if one looks at Christian teaching, Christ taught us that this is going to be challenged throughout humanity. One has to be salt and light, that people would be hated. You have to be prepared to deal with this kind of hostility. The question then is that, is that of a capitalist system, or is that simply a much more human solvent that was going to be out there challenging a much deeper and profound and at times unpopular moral code that was more greatly rooted? So it strikes me the real issue here is not that capitalism necessarily destroys morality, but it shows that we have to have more of an emphasis on the moral infrastructure within which any market system operates. I've long argued that if one wants to have a free society, one also needs a virtuous society, and that many of my legal friends and colleagues miss that there are lots of reasons why you want a system in which people actually respect one another, care about human dignity and life. That these sorts of things matter in terms of constructing an order that is free, that it's much harder to have a liberal, free society if one does not have those underlying virtues. And the question then is how to promote them. And I think it shows the importance of institutions that receive social support, and that it's important to have tolerance and concern for others, that one also should be prepared to show moral judgments when one thinks it's important for the moral foundations of one's society. And I think what's an interesting question that was raised by Troy is that a market system necessarily requires free trade and necessarily requires immigration. It does strike me there's an important difference between the two. That one can certainly imagine a system that allows perfectly free trade, where one can accept the fact you can buy and sell with those with whom you have great moral differences, but one might be a little more choosy about who one invites to one's, to join one's community on a permanent basis, those who one invites to join and exercise political power, those who one invites in to help have the power to transform one's own society. And while I happen to think immigration is generally a good thing, I also think that it's quite fair to be concerned about the society that one's constructing and what those values are and what are the shared values and where is one going to. And that is one where it strikes me that Troy's concerns suggest this may be an issue that requires greater attention than it often gets, but I think there are some different questions there. And the other question, I think, is if one is concerned about the moral code but believes that a capitalist system is the right system, how does one, in a sense, evangelize on the moral code? What are the institutions out there? That no system, I think, is a moral code self-created, and a moral code that simply exists because it kind of was historic as opposed to having something much greater beneath it is not likely to survive, I think, any challenge. That it's not simply enough to say that it's out there in a shared consensus if it can't withstand challenge. What kind of a moral code is it? That, to my mind, again, the Christian theology suggests that it is going to be challenged, and that those who hold that have to be willing to give an answer and be, stand in its support, and they should be able to stand in that support whether the challenge comes from statism or from capitalism. And indeed, I step back from listening to Troy and wonder, is there any moral society on earth at any time? I mean, I look at ancient Rome, and that certainly doesn't look like it would match that in terms of what happened to Rome, or Athens. Maybe Sparta would fit, not exactly the moral code that I would necessarily want to support. Perhaps Saudi Arabia today comes close, but it's not one which I think any humane person would want to view as a grand moral code to support, or that of President Xi Jinping in China, and where he is attempting to move China today. That I wonder what kind of a society in fact can preserve a moral code under these circumstances. It looks to me like it's virtually impossible. And then we're kind of back to, it's not really a problem in my mind of capitalism, it's a problem of the human condition. And how does one respond to that challenge? How does one respond then to what seems to be a universal solvent, a universal poison, a universal acid as opposed to a capitalist acid? And I think there, it's, we go back to the kind of morality that we're promoting and what is underlying it, what the foundations are. And I suspect this is going to be a challenge we will be having to deal with in many years to come, because these issues are not going to go away. And if you look at our political system today, I think they're likely to grow greater rather than less. Thank you very much.
Thank you to both of our speakers, and since we introduced one before the other, then we will say first this time to keep everything in its rotating fashion. Thank you very much to you, Troy Catterson. Thank you very much. And to you, Doug Bandow. Applause for both, please. Thanks as well to the one that kept everything honest and on time, Ivana Perry, student here at Northwood, who was keeping time for us. Very well done. Thank you. And for my own sake, thanks to Professor Moots for inviting me to participate. It's been an honor and a privilege. Again, very, very good questions and much to think about as things move forward. It is my understanding that there is some form of a reception that is following, which you're all invited to attend. I don't know all the comings and goings of where, but I guess just beyond, just outside the door, so that should be easy enough to find. So thank you very much.